We all know the story of the Enclave, the remnant of America's government, able to keep America alive in them but never able to reclaim it. We know they met their apparent end at Adams Air Force Base in the capital, but back west, many years ago, the Enclave was on the verge of total victory, yet they were stopped mere hours before their plan would reach fruition, and the Enclave's main base, a towering oil rig, was destroyed. But this wasn't the end. Navarro, the Enclave's largest base on the mainland, was still active. It would be here where the remaining Enclave survivors would rally, and then many would split off to head east to Raven Rock to heed the call of their new president. This left Navarro isolated and alone. Years passed and the powers of the West grew, the NCR being one of them. They would attack Navarro and wipe out the Enclave once and for all on the west coast. But what if? What if the rest of the Enclave had stayed at Navarro? Let's take a look at this scenario. As Control Station Enclave goes up in flames and the horizon bleeds a blinding white, the few vertibirds that manage to escape the devastation make their way to the largest remaining Enclave base, Camp Navarro. Upon arrival, they clarified the situation to the base staff. The oil rig was gone, along with the leadership. They were all alone now. This news was followed by a deafening silence. No one had any idea what to do now, so they just stood there in disbelief. Eventually, a scientist by the name of Autumn attempted to take command, preaching of a new president, calling to them over the airwaves, calling them to the east. However, it was at this point the highest remaining officer, Lieutenant Colonel Alder, shut down Autumn, declaring his proposal a fool's gamble. She then declared that the Enclave was now at war, and put Navarro as well as the remaining outposts on alert. The second order was to reactivate Project, codename Annihilation. It was time to go on the offensive. From the way it stood currently, everything non-Enclave was to be treated as hostile. It was no longer about reclaiming the mainland, it was about survival. To achieve this, Navarro had to be expanded. New quarters, new facilities, new defenses. The Enclave was vulnerable right now, but Alder was determined to prevent America from dying here. Months passed and the situation eased slightly, but the bases remained on high alert with no one allowed to leave. One by one, the furthest outposts were shut down, any useful materials were taken and the rest were destroyed. After which, the Enclave began flying vertibirds out to the old Sierra Army Depot, one of the few intact pre-war facilities in the region. They removed and transported as much as they could. The facility was gutted of all its equipment. Thanks to the influx of equipment and materials, Navarro was slowly expanded, adding quarters for the mass of new base inhabitants, including 3 mysterious soldiers that wandered into Navarro from the desert one day, claiming to be from the oil rig. More research and development facilities for weapons, more turrets, guard towers, and recharging stations for the sentry bots. Even a farm behind the base, although Alder insisted it have radiation protection built over it. The work progressed slowly thanks to the lack of resources, but luckily many of the people who escaped the rig were part of the engineering corps that were working near the vertibirds. The project subsequently increased in development speed thanks to the better facilities cannibalized from the other outposts. It wasn't too long before the project was completed and Alder would plan to use it. To ensure the completion of her plan, she held a briefing for one of the elite units, the Devil's Brigade, explaining the next steps. The Enclave's enemies attacked the rig and destroyed the leadership, so it was only a matter of time before they targeted the remaining bases, including Navarro. The only option was to strike first, and the main target was San Francisco. The ship that the saboteurs used to enter the rig came from San Francisco. It was clear to Alder that it was one final attempt from the Chinese to finish off America. The only reasonable response was regular Enclave protocol, complete extermination of the threat. Alder explained the mission to the troopers as they prepared to head out. Entrusting the mission and potentially America's future on him, Alder tasked the army of the payload to Major Gannon. So as the sun set and the light began to wane, the vertibird rotors began to whir and the mechanical predators lifted off the ground and disappeared into the night sky. Through the ocean of darkness, the vertibirds came diving down to the empty streets of San Francisco. The soldiers swarmed out, circling the birds as Major Gannon placed down the device and activated it. And just as quickly as they had appeared, they were gone. Soaring away into the distance, they raced to get away as far as possible before, boom. The sky suddenly turned from night to day as the horizon grew orange with nuclear fire, wiping out San Francisco in an instant and creating a cloud big enough to see for miles. Even though the vertibirds were going full speed, they were only barely outrunning the dust clouds. But eventually they made it clear. Once the vertibirds returned to base, the soldiers were met with praise of a successful mission. Alder personally congratulated Gannon on wiping out the rig saboteurs and invited him to celebrate the victory. But he could only focus on one thing. He furiously asked why she didn't warn him or his team of the massive explosive power of the payload. Alder carefully explained it was not her intent to put them in danger, that the weapon was experimental, much larger than the weapons used pre-war. It was the Enclave's original plan to reclaim the mainland, by wiping the slate clean. Gannon subsequently apologized and sheepishly accepted the invite to celebrate alongside everyone else. As the months went by, Navarro continued its sluggish expansion as the Enclave was lulled into a false sense of security from the peace and quiet. While the Enclave knew the NCR was the biggest obstacle to reclaiming their country, they knew it would be a long time before they could hope to win against them. The best option was to avoid contact with them. After all, Navarro was a hidden base, burrowed deep in an expansive forest. But even with Navarro being hidden, a good defense would be required if the worst were to occur. The Enclave would need to increase their size and production if they were to survive. But once the expansion ground to a halt from the lack of resources, Lieutenant Colonel Alder conjured a new plan to feed their expansion. She summoned what few officers remained to discuss the plan. As the dozen or so remaining officers met with Alder, she began outlining the proposal, stating that the Enclave had previously made deals with the scum of the settlement known as New Reno for raw materials in exchange for weaponry. They could begin dealing with the families of New Reno again, supplying them with energy weapons in exchange for materials, and after those scum had all killed each other, they could swoop in and take what remains, then burn down the rest. Major Gannon objected to Alder's plan, however, citing their need to stay hidden. Opening dealings with Wastelanders would surely stifle any and all rumours of the Enclave's demise, and would certainly leave a trail open to anyone searching for them. Gannon was adamant this would lead to conflict with the NCR. He insisted that if they were to go through with this plan, that he at least be able to journey to the Iron Mountain relay facility and attempt to contact any remaining Enclave cells for support. Alder immediately shut down the idea, however, reminding him of the fact that Iron Mountain was in the Silent Zone. A few of the officers agreed with Gannon's proposal, but the majority sided with Alder, so she ordered the preparations be made to reopen dealings with New Reno. Before long, the vertibirds were being pulled out of storage and once again soaring off into the sky. It was almost as if things were back to normal. The Enclave once more had a mission, and everyone was eager to ensure that this time it would reach completion. Journey after journey, trade after trade, the Enclave saw an influx of raw materials to utilize in their expansion. As the weeks of this continued into months, Navarro's store of energy weapons started to dwindle. This baffled the officers, as they surely thought that by now, with the immense supply of their energy weapons, that one of the families in New Reno would have made a move against the others. With some closer reconnaissance of the city, it was determined that the Enclave's plan to provoke war by way of empowering the gangs had the exact opposite effect. The supply of energy weapons had cooled the political climate. The awareness of each other's dealings with the Enclave had led the families into a stalemate of almost certain mutually assured destruction. Naturally, this was unacceptable. Alder authorized the false flag operation to be carried out against the gangs of New Reno. A small team was sent into the city disguised as gang members, approaching the largest building they could see, the Shark Club Casino, and opening fire on everyone they saw, burning holes through guards and gamblers alike, leaving only a few witnesses to tell the tale. The soldiers ran away in haste before any more guards could come. As the vertibirds flew off into the distance, the soldiers could only hope that this would be enough to instigate a gang war, lest the Enclave have to part with a considerable amount of weaponry or risk losing more soldiers in an all-out assault of the city. It seemed fortune was in the Enclave's favour, however, as the following days yielded great news for Navarro. The bishops had assumed a rival gang was responsible for the massacre at the casino, leading to armed conflict between the gangs. The gang's hunger for more weapons turned to desperation as the war raged on. In their rabid desire for more tools of war, the Enclave found themselves able to trade much less for much more. After 2 weeks, Navarro's energy weapon reserves were almost empty. With the gang severely weakened by all the conflict, Alder decided now was the time to strike. As night fell, the citizens of New Reno heard a violent wind echoing through the valley, slowly getting louder and louder. They soon came to the realization that it was not wind, but something mechanical. Although this came far too late, as mere minutes later, vertibirds touched down in the streets. Swarms of Enclave troops rushed out of the vertibirds and drew their weapons on everyone they saw, opening fire in the streets, cutting through crowds of people in their way. As the bodies piled up and the streets ran red with blood, many tried desperately to escape the carnage. With the Enclave sweeping through the streets shooting on sight, some decided to escape the city, yet this was merely another path to death's door. The circling vertibirds made quick work of the few who attempted to leave, mowing them down as they stepped out into the open, ensuring that no one would escape to tell of what happened there. The other survivors decided to flock to the casinos and drug dens protected by the families. Little did they know they were making the Enclave's job easier. As the Enclave's shock troopers burst into each of the buildings, guns blazing, the remaining gang members attempted a feeble defense. The families managed to take down a handful of Enclave soldiers using their own weapons against them, but their luck soon ran out and the following strikes by the vengeful soldiers were swift and brutal. Surrender was not accepted and no mercy was given. The soldiers swept through the building, shooting everything that moved, ensuring no survivors. By dawn, the soldiers had killed every last citizen of New Reno. They gave the signal and the fleet of remaining vertibirds came to answer. All of the weapons were recovered and any useful equipment or material was salvaged. Once the city had been stripped of everything useful to the Enclave, they set a match to it, watching the hellhole burn as they rode off in their vertibirds. Another successful mission for the Enclave. Their weapons had been reclaimed and they could continue their expansion with the salvage. They were inching ever closer to toppling the NCR and gaining control of the region. While the Enclave thought they were safe from the NCR and their hidden base, there's one thing they didn't account for: the Brotherhood of Steel. The Brotherhood, of course, knew where Navarro was, and knew of its purpose. Once word spread around that 2 cities had been wiped from the map, the citizens of NCR demanded action, but no one had any clue who or what was responsible. There were rumours that it could be the mysterious group that used to be seen flying around the region, however that was as much information as anyone had. At least until the Brotherhood intervened, citing an opportunity to rid themselves of the one group that had superior technology to them, as if it was such a crime to defy the Brotherhood's rule of technology. They told the NCR everything they knew: the Enclave, its technology, Navarro. The clock had begun ticking and no one knew it. It only took the NCR a few days to mobilize a large military force to send to Navarro. The Rangers were deployed ahead to scout out the base, find its weak points and pick them apart. Once the Rangers gave the go-ahead, the army came charging in, moving quietly through the trees in the dead of night. The NCR army slowly surrounded the unaware Enclave base. When the signal was given, the NCR troops opened fire on everything in sight. Navarro was caught completely off guard. The hail of bullets cut through everything and everyone outside. The turrets began suppressing the NCR troopers, but this would only hold them for a short amount of time. The entirety of the base began gearing up. They had to get the vertibirds up in the air if they were going to survive. By the time the main forces got up to the surface, the turrets and the sentry bots were laying fire into the trees but were getting whittled down by the unseen enemy. And unfortunately, NCR troops had made their way into the front entrance. The Enclave's best heavy gunners ran to the front gates to start spraying the invaders down. The walls of laser fire halted the NCR's advance into the base, but there were already NCR troopers in the base. The Enclave soldiers began spreading out through the base, trying to kill any hostiles trying to enter the base. While this was happening, the NCR army was still attacking from all directions outside the base. The main force headed for the hangars, where more heavy gunners ran forward to help the robots suppress the NCR soldiers outside. Laying down fire through the trees, the ground crews rushed the vertibirds out of the hangars and the pilots began powering them up as the NCR soldiers started focusing their fire on the birds. Left and right, vertibirds were getting torn up by bullets. The remaining few were able to launch into the air and began raining fire down onto the NCR troops. The NCR troopers tried returning fire, but they only made themselves greater targets. The troopers outside were being thinned down, but then came warning of troopers inside the lower levels. Save for the gunners at the front gate, all of the Enclave soldiers left the robots to clean up the outside attackers as they rushed downstairs and started hunting down the NCR troopers. Shots were heard coming from the armory, so the soldiers rushed over towards them, but once there they saw everyone was dead. All they heard was a strange beeping noise. As one of the soldiers looked at the ammo storage, he tried to warn everyone to fall back, but it was too late. The armory and most of the soldiers were engulfed in an explosion. The remaining Enclave soldiers were able to corner and execute the NCR troopers in the base shortly after, but the damage had already been done. Coming back up to the surface, the NCR army had retreated, but it was still a hollow victory. Alder ordered that the losses be counted up. The numbers weren't pretty. Over half of the base was dead and only a few vertibirds remained. Their position was compromised, and while they had defeated the NCR's forces, there was only a dent in their total number. They needed a plan, and fast. The only option Alder could see was to reactivate Project Annihilation. Upon hearing of this, Gannon stormed into Alder's office, berating her over the idea of using more nuclear weapons. He pleaded with her to allow him to travel to Iron Mountain to call the rest of the Enclave to Navarro. Alder once again denied him, stressing the severity of the situation. The idea of taking the last remaining vertibirds and soldiers into a no-fly zone to activate a dead installation to call out to ghosts was more than a gamble, it was suicide. She understood why he wanted to, but the only way for the Enclave to survive was to go nuclear again. She admitted she was truly sorry for what she had to do, but Gannon only replied, "I'm sorry too, Penny," as he drew his sidearm and aimed at Alder. "I'm relieving you of duty, Lieutenant Colonel." Alder angrily called her guards to the room and retorted, "You'll hang for this." And as Gannon's life flashed before his eyes, in that moment he knew what to do. As his sidearm was aimed at Alder, what did he do next? You decide. Does he shoot Alder or does he surrender? Click on the right side for shoot or left side for surrender.